everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams, spill the tea. And this week, we are coming at you with two brand new records, two big records. We're going to be talking about the new album from indie folk band Big Thief. Their new album, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You.
Well done. Well done. You've nailed that.
Okay.
I was so convinced you were going to...
I managed to remember the title. And we're also going to be talking about the new album, of course, from Beach House. We're talking about Once Twice Melody. It's a big double album kind of day, fun day. Gonna have a good time. And of course, joining us today, Big Thief and Beach House fan extraordinaire, we have with us Mica. Welcome to the show.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm very excited.
Well, it's an absolute, it's our pleasure, honestly, because I was thinking to myself a few weeks ago, like, because we've been having guests on for just about every episode this year so far. I was thinking to myself, who would be a good fit for an episode where we talk about Beach House and Big Thief? And you were just like constantly tweeting about both of those bands. And I was like, shit, we have to get Mica on, because like, I feel like any discussion would be, especially Big Thief, any discussion would be incomplete without you here. So, and Jake's got his Beach House vinyl as well. So that's looking pretty sick.
That might be giving the game away a little bit, but
yeah. I do have my Dragon New Warm Mountain vinyl as well.
That's
which I brought out so that I can have the lyric sheet with me in case I want to like talk about anything specific.
Yeah, I love it. You've come prepared. Well done. So very much the theme of this week's episode is Legacy Indie Acts release 80-minute double album, and Legacy Indie Act fans cream their jeans for it. That's basically going to be the broad theme. So in the last week on the channel, we've put out some great videos. We did a Record Club episode on Boards of Canada's Geo Gaddy, where we discussed one of the most legendary IDM records as on its 20th anniversary as well. And that was a really great conversation. We got really into the weeds with all of the kind of hidden messages and lore of that album. And then on Thursday, I dropped a video that I have been wanting to make for ages, which is a discussion of the discography of Steel-Laden, where I ranked all 9 of their albums. Regardless of whether you're into the band or completely unfamiliar with them, I've designed that video to be accessible and friendly for everyone. It's one of our shorter videos. So check that out if you're interested. Would mean a lot to us. But without further ado, let's kick into our first segment of the episode, which is the What We've Been Listening To segment. Jake, what have you been listening to?
Well, continuing my streak of listening to a bunch of fucking bullshit, I guess I'm also continuing a bit of a streak of trying to plow through that fucking Black Sabbath discography, because I'm hell-bent on doing a video about it eventually, and I'm still unfortunately in the dark era. I'm still struggling a little bit. I this week listened to 2 actually. I jumped forward a little bit and from going them in order and listened to 1994's Dehumanizer, which is an album that Ronnie Dio came back for, and it's generally considered like one of the better albums in the second half. And it was mainly just because I needed to reassure myself that there were better records on the horizon, just to keep myself motivated. But the next proper entry in the discography is The Eternal Idol, which is not nearly as divisive as the records I've been talking about previously. It's get a bit of a breather here. It's definitely not one of the favorites exactly, but honestly, I enjoyed this. I think it's probably the best album they've put out since probably like Mob Rules. It's not anything special, really. In fact, it's a lot more of the same. That said, I think the song construction on this album is a little bit better. If anything, if you're a Black Sabbath fan, you've got to listen to it for the final track, the title track, Eternal Idol, which is easily the best song they've made in like 10 years at this point. I have nothing fun to articulate about this record just because it's not nearly as overwhelmingly disliked as something like Seven Star. It's not as absolutely disgusting to listen to as something like Born Again. I just have a feeling that a lot of these next couple albums are going to be a little bit more of the same in terms of late 80s, early 90s heavy metal, which I'm fine with at this point. If all I have to deal with is 30 to 40 minute long albums of Black Sabbath kind of spinning their wheels, so be it. I'll live. That's fine by
I'm
me.
so excited for you to get to Cross Purposes and Forbidden. Like that's gonna be an
I don't
all-timer
wanna.
segment of like once great bands falling to unfathomable lows,
I'm
like
trying to
career
hold
killing lows.
I'm trying to hold steady because the only album on Rate Your Music that's below a 3 so far, I think, other than I think Never Say Die, was Seventh Star, and I like that album. So I'm holding steady, not for Forbidden necessarily, because I don't. That's the one with Ice-T on it, I think.
Yeah, it is.
So I'm not exactly going into that one with high expectations. That said, I mean, it's good.
Well,
Moving
I
on.
mean, maybe the way to look at it is that at around the same time, Chuck D was on Sonic Youth's Goo, and that was a great rap feature on a rock record. So maybe Ice-T will deliver some heat on Black Sabbath's Forbidden. Who knows?
I mean, conceptually, it sounds kind of cool. Like, I don't know, like maybe it could be fun. Anyway, in slightly better music news, I've been listening to. I actually went and listened to after our discussion on GeoGaddy, I listened to the Campfire Head Phase, the album after that one. And I love that album. I don't really have an interesting take on it or anything because I still think that GeoGaddy and Music Has the Right to Children are better albums, but this is something that gets bizarrely overlooked and really shouldn't. It's a different kind of album. It has a lot of like guitar driven chord progressions on it, but my God, it's beautiful. Like I really like the whole album, honestly, but the second half of it just has some of the best songs that the band have come out with so far in my listening to of them. So like, don't overlook that one just because, it's not one of the hugely heralded releases from the band or anything. On a night where I couldn't sleep, I listened to that to try to go to sleep. And then I listened to my favorite I Am Awake at 3 a.m. and Don't Know What to Do with My Life album, which is Phil Elverum Mount Erie's Clear Moon. I think that is my favorite Mount Erie project. It's that or maybe Lost Wisdom Part 2, which is like, I don't think either of those two albums are anybody's favorite, but Phil is too good of a musician for everybody to agree unanimously on anything he's made other than maybe like Glow Part 2. But I love Clear Moon. Clear Moon is so fucking like, that is such a gorgeous, textural, beautifully written, deeply kind of spiritual album experience. Every time I listen to it, I feel like I've learned something new about either myself or Phil or music or anything. It's just a gorgeous album. I own it and Ocean Roar on like a double vinyl, and they sound incredible on them. But that's a sort of moment in his career that I think is deeply underappreciated, underrated. The sort of like Wind's Poem, Ocean Roar, Clear Moon era.
It's like a super overlooked era, I think, of Mount Erie sound, particularly now. I'm just gonna like go out on a limb here. Mount Erie feels like it might be Mica core. Do you have any like Mount Erie takes or opinions on any of these records?
I do. In fact, Clear Moon is possibly my favorite Mount Erie record as well. I completely agree with everything you said. Beautifully haunting and textured, and yeah, gorgeously textured. He always has a track on his albums that are like labeled something or something like that, with like parentheses, and those are always just like a weird kind of textural experiment, and it's just like just beautiful, very evocative too. I do like a lot of Mount Erie stuff. I think my overall favorite Phil project is still The Glow Part 2, but yeah, Clear Moon, A Crow Looked at Me, Lost Wisdom, Dawn as well. Dawn is incredible.
Yeah.
All those are great.
Love, I mean, hey, I think that was also something that like listening to Big Thief might have prompted, is that sort of like getting into that little spirit. And speaking of which, just because recently I've been listening to a lot of Americana inflicted music, I went and listened to an artist and just an era of country music that I've needed to explore for a very long time, and I elected to get into it with Phases and Stages by one Mr. Willie Nelson. which is a pretty short record. It's sub 40 minutes, but it's one of his more lauded projects because it is a concept album that's pretty much, it's just like, this is like the original concept breakup album. And goddamn, this shit's good. Willie Nelson, I mean, classic voice, classic songwriter. Pretty much everything on here is immaculately written and performed. It has that really quintessential kind of rootsy sound to it. And it's just, there's something about his music specifically that occasionally sounds like really like bigger and grander than a lot of stuff out of that era, but also he can really, you know, move into something that's a little bit more stripped back and peeled back that feels like basically just the contrasting sort of levels of energy really make you feel like this is a super interesting holistic project. And it's not like something that's overwhelmingly sad because it's about like, you know, the deterioration of relationships. There's like a wide spectrum of emotion on here. It's a brief listen. It's a very well constructed record. I highly recommend it for anybody who's looking to like explore that sort of era. I 100%, and Willie in general is just a dude who's cranked out tons of classic records in the past. Shout out to the fact that the podcast's sort of core favorite metal band, folk metal / atmospheric black metal band Panopticon, I started a subreddit for Panopticon the other day because they don't have one, and that's bullshit because they should. As some might know, last year's And Again Into the Light was our album of the year collectively, and I have, for whatever reason, like I've downloaded everything they've ever made and just haven't listened to the rest of their albums because I'm dumb. But I listened to
Roads to the North,
and shock of all shocks, a canonically recognized Panopticon album is a fucking masterpiece. It's like probably the best thing I listened to this week that was not immediately rated to podcast listening. But oh god, Austin just doesn't fucking miss. I can't believe that the album run of Autumn Eternal and Roads to the North and the Scars of Man on the Once Nameless Wilderness exists. It's like that man does not know how to make a project that's anything less than just the best shit you've ever heard. I'm toying with the idea of making a video about them sometime in the future just because they need more exposure, but surprise, surprise, it's great. Other than that, I listened to, I guess this is sort of inevitable, is that 2022 takes another musical legend in the form of Mark Lanegan. So I listened to one of the Queens of the Stone Age albums that he appears on, Lullabies to Paralyze, which is, in my opinion, their most underrated album. I love that thing. I part of me like kind of gets why other people don't, but at the same time, I listen to like the A side of that record and I'm just like, nah, this is just heat. Fuck everybody. But I also listened to an album that I was really shocked to learn is a covers album, which is called I'll Take Care of You, which is a solo record of his, which is weird because it doesn't feel like a covers album at all. It's so cohesive, both thematically and sonically, but he adds a lot of personality to each of them. And Mark had this just wonderful, like really sort of like rustic kind of voice to him that just makes anything he's saying unbelievably enrapturing. I'm not familiar with like his most prominent stuff with like Screaming Trees, but I know I need to, just because that kind of music is shit that I bang for already. So obviously very much looking forward to getting into that.
I will build on what you were saying about Mark Lanegan, who, his loss this week was fucking awful, fucking brutal, way too young as well. I know that Lanegan was one of the grunge guys who very much lived fast and, didn't really it was a devil may care in a lot of ways. But still, it doesn't make it any easier to process his loss, especially considering that, I mean, now of not only of like the grunge figureheads, but like even the wider world of like the top tier grunge bands, like Eddie Vedder is like the only front man left.
God bless, that's sad.
And that's, that's tough. As great as he is, it's tough to have lost so many others. But so I revisited two Screaming Trees records this week, the two kind of most renowned ones. Dust, of course, but the one I want to highlight, my favorite Screaming Trees record, which is Sweet Oblivion, which turns 30 later this year, and we will be doing a video on it around the time that it turns 30 as well, because I think that is one of the best ways we can pay tribute to Mark. But this is not only my favorite record that I've heard from Mark or from anything that he's been involved in. Even Queens of the Stone Age, actually, this is still my favorite thing Mark's done. Not only that, but I also think that it is one of the best grunge records. And I have to put my hands up and say, before this week, I'd only heard Dust. And so when we were talking about, when we were doing our 1991 retrospective last year, and we were talking about all these landmark grunge records that were coming out at that time, I had no idea about Sweet Oblivion, or at least I had no idea how much I would love that record. But listening to it this week, it just absolutely connected with me. And honestly, it was difficult not to cry while listening to it, particularly some of the songs like No One Knows and of course the legendary Nearly Lost You, which is one of the most well-known Screaming Trees songs. It's
Open
a great
Mike Eagle tweeted that song, and I listened to it and was like, I'm gonna need a while to be able to build this, because this is a lot.
It is a great grunge record. It has some beautiful deep cut highlights as well, like For Celebrations Past and Troubled Times, that seem to get very little love, but I put them on and they just blew me away. The best way I can describe the appeal of this record is it's like Alice in Chains if they kind of embraced a more psychedelic aspect to their sound and sort of leant into that. It's very much, I think Alice in Chains are the kind of grunge, top tier grunge band that Screaming Trees bear the most resemblance to. And I mean, we're big fans of Alice in Chains. They're certainly, I think, deserve a little bit more love than they get relative to some of their grunge peers. But yeah, this is just an essential listen. I can't recommend it highly enough. And Dust as well, because most people love Dust more than this. So, and I think they're both, right up there. I just narrowly prefer Sweet Oblivion. But yeah, so that's that. Rest in peace to Mark. And I'm going to be listening to more and more of his solo music over the coming weeks too. On a lighter note, I want to shout out a record that was recommended to me by a mutual friend of Jake and myself, Spencer, a album this is a Japanese album that is apparently under the genre city pop, which I wasn't super familiar with, but it's kind of like a disco-y, funky sort of Eastern pop music that was quite big in the late 70s, early 80s. And so the artist is called Tatsuro Yamashita, and the album is called Ride on Time. And Tatsuro Yamashita apparently is one of the most highly regarded artists of his time. And this album itself it's very clear when you listen to this why that is. This is an absolutely infectiously fun record. Yamashita's guitar playing is ecstatic and astounding. The grooves and the rhythm section are so tight and so fulsome that you're so locked in. There's a sense of sheer joy to this album that's so infectious. The elements of funk that are so deeply infused into this are so like catchy and addictive and awe-inspiring and awesome. And so yeah, this was a really fun record that I had no idea about this artist, and so I'm grateful for the recommendation because this is just super fun. And so I highly recommend it. Okay, so I'll finish off by shouting out a couple of brand new albums that have just come out in the last couple of weeks that I have had recommended to me. The first is an album from math rock / indie rock band Gyocho, and the album is called Let's Promise to Be Happy. And the band Gyocho are a relatively new band. They're a Japanese math rock band. And if you know anything about this podcast, you'll know that we love a bit of Japanese math rock. We recently reviewed the new Trico album, which is also great. And if you enjoy that record, or if the idea of Japanese math rock that's tailored through the lens of indie rock sensibilities appeals to you, you cannot miss this record. It's already leapt into my top 10 of the year so far. It's absolutely ridiculously technically great. It's only about 25 minutes long, I think, so it's really short, but it just does not waste a moment of that time in creating these really infectious grooves. As far as math rock goes, I'd say it's one of the more accessible versions of the genre. So if you're not super into like really, overwhelming clashing rhythms and stuff, then Gyocho are a really good entry point. I think there's a flavor of Midwest emo infused into this album as well that gives it a really nice kick too. But more often than not, it's just a ridiculously enjoyable and entertaining ride. And so, yeah, only 25 minutes long. Absolutely check it out. It is so, so good. And the last thing I will check out is a new album from an indie rock band that was getting a lot of hype on IndieCast, the Stephen Hayden and Ian Cohen's music podcast, which regular listeners of our podcast will know that I listen to religiously every week. And they were getting quite excited about a new band called String Machine, who are also, I think, Stereo Gum's current band to watch on their website. And String Machine are a new indie rock band from Philadelphia, and they're putting out their third album this year, which has the fantastic title of Hallelujah, Hell Yeah. And it is a absolutely raucous 30-minute indie rock record with lots of heart and spirit and lots of really kind of creative musicianship and really exciting playing and great singing and just really kinetic performances. You can tell that these guys have really gotten used to being a band, and they've really kind of gotten in tune with each other as performers, and they're playing their heart out on this album. It's not like it will be, I think, an acquired taste for some people, especially if you're not super into like really angular indie rock, but it's not like any of the sort of post-punky stuff that we've been getting over the last couple of years. It's much kind of brighter and sunnier than that. And yeah, it's only 32 minutes long. For some reason, despite the fact that it seems pretty hyped among kind of indie critical circles, it only has 5 ratings on Radio Music as we speak. Although, to be fair, it did just come out yesterday. But it deserves to have a wider audience. I had a really great time listening to it. I'm going to go back to it. It's hard to complain about it when it's so tight, so lean, and so absolutely free of filler. So yeah, I highly recommend that for if you want a good kick of the latest in indie rock. And that's basically been my week. Mica, what have you been listening to lately that you want to shout out?
One record, probably the one that I've been most in love with the past like couple weeks, is called I Need to Start a Garden by Heynderickx. So this is from 2018. It's an indie rock and like folk and a smattering of like Midwest emo to it. It's a very short album. It's only like 30 minutes. And it's by this artist who has this incredible voice and this like strange kind of lyricism that I would actually compare to Adrian a little bit, just because of just because of like weird references that she'll make that feel very personal, very like kind of mystifying too. And there's just really good songwriting, really good guitar playing. I read that she was influenced by John Fahey's style, who I haven't listened to a lot of, but I've gotten into a bit of like American primitivism type stuff via like Jim O'Rourke. And I would compare her guitar style to Jim, and like maybe a little like Elliott Smith, a little like Beatles-esque stuff. The title of the album, I Need to Start a Garden, there's one part where there's like the bridge of a song where she starts screaming it. And it's just a very cathartic moment. And it's just a very fun album, very pretty too. And I'm looking forward to her coming back. She's like kind of someone who's kind of a shadowy figure in the indie world, because she's only released a little bit of stuff, and it's been like 4 years now. So I feel like it'll be like a quiet event when she does come back. Another record I've been really into is Lance by Niños del Cerro. I hope I said that right. This is a band that takes a little bit after like Animal Collective. They have a way of like breaking from really beautiful sounding stuff, really catchy indie rock style stuff, into like really noisy. I've seen someone compare them to Swans at times, with some of the directions they can take their tracks in, where it'll be like a really fun and hype kind of like Feels era Animal Collective stuff, and then they'll take that into like a kind of noise rock, maybe like a Sonic Youth kind of style. So yeah, that one I highly recommend. Every time I show that album to someone, it seems like they end up falling in love with it. It just has like a certain vibe to it that people seem to fuck with. My third record is going to be a new one. This is called Continuance by Currency and The Alchemist. The Alchemist, of course, is a legendary hip hop producer, and Currency is like, I guess, a stoner rapper who I listened to before I ever like smoked weed or anything. I listened to him a lot in like junior high and high school. I have a lot of fondness for some old mixtapes of his. He used to do stuff with Wiz Khalifa, and Wiz Khalifa actually showed up on this album, much to my delight. Wiz hasn't like been a very I feel like he doesn't try that much with his music nowadays, and hasn't for a long time. But those old mixtapes that he had, old songs, are still just like get me super hyped. And to have him on the album and to have Currency just like kill it track after track, just like throwing all of his personality over there, over these you know, Alchemist with his gorgeous loops and whatnot. I think it's a really good album.
Yeah,
So there's that.
I'll have to check this one out. I've been curious about this one. I see Boldy James is on it as well, who I love.
Yes.
Last year we reviewed his record that he made with The Alchemist, which I think we all liked quite a bit. And so like we've reviewed The Alchemist collaborations like a few times, and like sometimes I think he really hits the mark with the production, and other times he's maybe not the best fit for the artist. But with that Boldy James record, it was like that was so good. So I've never listened to Currency, but I'm curious to see how their styles kind of meld, because it looks like a really interesting album.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a good time. It's I don't think it's not reinventing the wheel or anything, and I wouldn't say that it's on par with what was the Boldy James record, the first one that he did with Alk last year. I can't remember the name, but Bo Jackson.
Yeah, Bo Jackson.
That album is great. I would say that one, like the chemistry between Alk and Boldy is just crazy. And even on this album, I would say the best track is the one with Boldy. That there's a vocal sample that's used throughout it that is just hypnotic. I love it. So yeah, I do highly recommend Continuance. And then I'll do one more rec, and that is a new album that dropped just last night, and this is Squeeze by SASAMI.
Oh yeah, I've been meaning to listen to this.
Yeah. SASAMI is just so cool to me. Like her personality, watching her in interviews. She said something in an interview once where she was like, literally like everyone on earth should make albums. Everyone should make music and express themselves in like a variety of ways. And she from what I understand, she works with kids to teach them music, and she's just really into like art being a truly universal thing, and the creation of it being that. So I find that really inspiring. And that kind of like
fucking terrifying.
Yeah, it's I think it's so awesome.
Like a Junji Ito monster.
And it fits too.
Awesome.
So like her debut album was like, I guess, pretty standard indie rock. Some of it like took after Stereolab because of the kind of like motoric beats that she would use on there. But it had like a very melancholic sound, very kind of sparse sound. This new one though, there are indie rock tracks again, but they're not really like taking after Stereolab or anything. They're more like anthemic, and I'd say more like classic indie rock. And those are mixed with tracks that are like industrial and alternative metal. Like it reminded me a tiny bit of Slipknot at times, who I haven't listened to a ton of, but like I remember as a kid coming across them and being terrified of them in a way that kind of reminds me of this cover, where just like their get-ups would just horrify me. But then eventually, like listening to their music, I found like there's like a real charm to it that I found. So yeah, Squeeze by SASAMI, highly recommend that new album.
Yeah, I've been meaning to listen to it. I saw it like as soon as that dropped, it seemed to be getting a lot of buzz as well. I think that's also Stereo Gum's album of the week this week too. So that album cover, like you said, Jake, that's kind of every time I see that, it just kind of like sticks in my brain because it's
thought
so
of her
striking.
working with children is amazing.
No, good for her. I'm really excited to dig into that. Awesome. Well, without further ado then, let's move into the first of our main reviews today, which is, of course, the new Big Thief album, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You. Now, Big Thief. Typically what we do at the top of these reviews is give a little bit of context for who the band are and how they arrived to this particular point in their career. Mica, you're our guest and you're the most avowed Big Thief fan here. I've grown in the last couple of weeks to be like right up there in terms of like the Big Thief fandom. I hate that I just used that word, but I still have no doubt that you're even higher up there than me. So why don't you talk a little bit about, like, lead off the bat about how you kind of encountered this band, your relationship with this band, how this band have kind of developed over the last sort of 5-6 years, and all the sort of contextual info that you think that we should know before we sort of start talking about the songs on this album.
I first discovered this band when I saw the album cover for their second album, Capacity, which came out in like 2017. I don't even remember where exactly I saw it, but ever since I saw it, it was just the most striking photo. And a big thing with me is like, if something has an interesting album art, then that immediately makes me want to listen to the music. Because I feel like if you have a good visual eye, that usually goes with an interesting ear for sounds and stuff. So I remember I was in a park and I put on Capacity, and the first track, Pretty Things, just like hit me like a ton of bricks. The way that Adrian can talk about, gender issues, toxic masculinity, can talk about sex as a form of catharsis and a form of love and bonding. The way she does that on that track is just like, that was the first time I listened to them, and it was one of those moments similar to when I listened to Joanna for the first time, where I was just like, I just found someone incredibly special. I'm about to fall in love with a new artist. You just know that from the moment right there. So yeah, Capacity was my first one, but to go back a little bit, I believe it was in 2016 when they dropped their first album, Masterpiece, which very seemingly like a very cocky title, but it's named for an actual track on the album that I think is just like really sweet, has a kind of Neil Young vibe to it that I didn't really pick up on a lot of Big Thief stuff until recently. But yeah, Neil Young is like a huge reference point for them.
Yeah, there's a song on this new record that sounds like something you would hear on a Crazy Horse record from the late 70s, where they're just kind of like going absolutely nuts. Like, it's specifically the song Love, 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 which sounds like a Crazy Horse recording where you just have like presumably Buck going like absolutely nuts and just doing this squalling kind of guitar passage that's like filtered really strangely to sound like muffled and eerie. And it just reminded me so much of that. But also, yeah, Adrian's performance style, and even to some extent her writing style in certain ways, can evoke songwriters like Neil, I think. So yeah, I think the influence is definitely, you can hear that.
On Masterpiece, I would say that there was a kind of, they still have this youthful energy, like the way that they just dropped a 20-track album with tons of different styles, and just there's nothing more that I love than an album where you can feel the artists were bursting with creativity and we're just having a great time. And that's what you feel on this one. On their previous, like, what was it, 4 or 5 albums that they had done before this, the creativity is there, but it's just not as like in your face, tons of styles being thrown at you. But there's still like a lot of interesting stuff on their that they did early on. So like on Masterpiece, you have a lot of indie folk and indie rock and whatnot, but there's also some like math rock popping in. There's a little bit of ambient stuff. The track Velvet Ring, which is a really beautiful track and really short. You would think that a track that's only like a couple minutes long and admittedly doesn't have like the strongest ending would not like stick in your mind, but just those couple short verses and then this weird sort of like, it's hard for me to describe this, but it's like sometimes the way they make their music, it makes it sound like it's like out of time, or like they're looking in on time from an outside perspective. That's how I feel sometimes when they go ambient, or on a few tracks on the new album that hopefully I'll talk about later, where they do that. So yeah, Masterpiece, Capacity. Also about Capacity, I feel a real Radiohead influence on that one. A song like Great White Shark totally makes me think of Radiohead, like in Rainbow's era. And it's awesome. It's I've said this joke before, like Great White Shark is one of my favorite Radiohead songs, because it really does feel like them, but just super well done. And yeah, just right from the bat, Adrian's poetry, her songwriting, Buck's amazing background vocal harmonies with her, all of that, it just I don't know, for me it clicks for me. but I think there is a real kind of universal appeal to them, a way that they kind of get at like something to the core of like what it is to be human, they do in their music. From Capacity, we had 2 more albums in 2019. We had UFOF, which had a lot of hype behind it, I remember. That was another one that I got caught up in. So like I had heard Capacity on its own between hype cycles for albums. But then when UFOF came, that was one where I was like listening to all the singles and whatnot. And they went in a different direction there as well. It's a lot dreamier. It's a lot more psychedelic. It's also has a run of tracks like in the first half that are just devastating. Some of the most devastating tracks I've ever heard. From and
oh god, yeah.
Open Desert, Orange.
Yeah,
unbelievable tracks. Just like almost traumatizing to the point that they're emotionally destructive. So yeah, and then later that year they dropped what up until this new album was my favorite Big Thief album, which was Two Hands, where they kind of went in what I realize now is the start of this kind of country direction. There was like on UFOF, you had the song Cattails, which is fucking incredible, one of their best songs. That has a bit of a country vibe, but Two Hands, they like on like a song like Release, where you have some of the magic that like goes into a lot of their songs, Buck's background vocal harmonies, a kind of a pulling of influence from an older band that doesn't like, at least I don't realize right away until later. So like it reminds me of Yo La Tengo doing a country song a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's awesome. And of course that album has the song Not, which was like that was like a tornado hitting the world of music. I feel like
that was my song of the year in 2019. I think it was for a lot of people actually. The band never, like, just when you think you have an idea of Big Thief's sort of sonic identity and even the limitations of Big Thief, they will just do something that completely upends all of that. And again, the Neil Young Crazy Horse comparison seems particularly apt for a song like that as well, because the solo in the second half of that song is like, that's like some Cortez the Killer shit right there. Like that's super, super, super like virtuosic stuff. And yeah, to me, like one of the great appeals of Big Thief has always been the relationship between the intimate but poetic and fractured and sort of enigmatic lyricism of Adrienne and her voice, of course, which is so crucial to the impact of a lot of what she sings as well. The way she's able to use it. She has what you might initially think, if you're new to the band, is quite a limited range, but she actually has a lot of skill and ability in terms of how she deploys it. And she is beautiful not only at writing really great lyrics, but at constructing them in the way that she sings to make them hooky and addictive, and also like without sacrificing any of the complication and weird abstraction that they often always have. So she's always been really, really good at that. And the way that has always interplayed with Buck's guitar playing as well. Obviously, Adrienne and Buck both play the guitar, with the drumming of James Krivcinia, who is incidentally the producer of this new record as well, which is an interesting note to maybe kind of consider at certain points. And of course, bassist Max Oliarczyk. These are 4 people who feel like they are kind of one organism in a big way. I think when I listen to their music, there is this sense of kind of melding together, that they kind of know each other so well, or they're connected on such an intimate level that they can communicate telepathically almost. Like they can follow each other's impulses and read what each other is thinking and seeing, and create music in this super kind of almost ethereal, spiritual way. And I'm trying not to read into it too much and project that onto them, but they have said, and they've described experiences of songwriting where it has kind of been like that, where they've just kind of sat down together and one of them sort of started playing a melody or started singing, and they've all just kind of like, the songs have just kind of come together out of thin air. Like the creative effort for Big Thief seems effortless from the way they describe it, at least. It seems like the songs just kind of come to them. And based on their output, I mean, from the last sort of 6 years, it seems like the songs just keep coming to them. I mean, this album, I mean, it is worth noting that this is obviously the longest gap we've had between Big Thief records, but it should also be noted that this was recorded in 2020. So they were already working on this basically around the same time that they were releasing UFOF and Two Hands. And so, yeah, the fact this is not like while this feels like you would assume this is something that's been intensely sort of labored over, and I mean, maybe perhaps to some extent it has been, what it seems to be the case is that these songs have kind of just come out of them. And that's always the impression that I get when I listen to Big Thief, is that they're able to channel some kind of, and this is going to sound silly, but they're able to channel some kind of like divine or spiritual energy that just allows them to make great music, and allows them to make music that can be quite minimal and at times and sometimes quite fractured, but feel like intense in some intangible way that connects you to it. I think that's very true of UFOF, which is such an ethereal and dreamy record that it took me a few listens to kind of wrap my head around it. But I think that's even truer of this record too, which is such an overwhelming experience the first time you listen to it, because 20 tracks, 80 minutes. There's a lot going on here. They're veering from one style to another. By all accounts, this record should not work. It should feel like a total mess. And maybe to some extent it does, but to me, it feels so holistically complete. I mean, there are songs here that just run into the next song. And like, for instance, at the moment where Flower of Blood goes into Blurred View, like those are two completely different songs, but they just kind of run into each other in a way that feels like it throws you off a little bit in terms of the juxtaposition, but you're never taken out of the experience by those kinds of shifts. And I don't know, man. I mean, it's just something about the experience that feels so like, that sucks you in so intimately and intensely, and never really hits a lull, or never really kind of lets you go out of that, at least for me anyway. Jake, at this point, I want to turn to you, because I literally, and this is actually a rare thing, I don't actually have a goddamn clue what you think of this album, because you haven't rated it. At least last time I checked, you hadn't rated it. And in a lot of ways, I'm glad. In a lot of ways, I'm anxious, because I know that you've had a bit of and if you like, you weren't really into UFOF, but then you really liked Two Hands, and those are kind of two polarities of their sound. And this is this kind of like collision of the two, but also with 7 other things thrown into it as well. So what was your experience like? Because I know you'll have listened to this a few times. What's your experience been like listening to this record? How did it hit you sort of initially, and how are you kind of feeling now?
Well, good to know that was 100% my intention, that I kept so tight-lipped about this very intentionally so that nobody would know what I thought. That said, my first exposure to Big Thief was actually through the songs and instrumentals stuff that Adrian put out, because the song it made our end of the year list, and so obviously I listened to it because of you, and I listened to that song and thought it was terrific. And I just knew that at that time that Big Thief were a big indie blog pitchfork kind of band, and the only thing I knew about them is that you have to let their music grow on you a little bit. So naturally, when I'm literally constantly listening to new shit for the podcast and for my own musical adventure, I'm not exactly super prone to go after a band that is super like discoursed and super like you have to devote a lot of time and attention to them. So naturally I was kind of like waiting for this opportunity to be able to do that. And UFOF was my first album from them, and I listened to it with the express intention of listening to it, waiting a while, and then listening to it again so I could get it. And it still really isn't for me, but really it was listening to that in combination with Two Hands that sort of let me see the matrix, as it were, with this band, and as to why they're popular is that the versatility of those two records alone is that, like, even though I didn't really connect with, I guess, probably the instrumental presence of UFOF, is that it still gives you an idea of just how multifaceted this band can be. And it was really good to understand that finally, because everybody's talking about this band, new album, a lot of hype behind it. So naturally I was like, okay, I feel like I get this now, so I can at least go in with a little bit more of an informed perspective. And then afterwards, of course, I was really nervous about listening to this because, naturally 80-minute album, double album, already kind of tenuous. And even though I really love Two Hands, it's a great fucking record. there's just no way of telling what you're, predicting what my reaction is going to be to a band like this that's still in many ways, I think, in their musical career's infancy. So, and not to mention the other insanely, supremely hyped record this year, the new Black Country New Road album, was one that I found myself at a considerable distance with. So when this was the second highest rated album of this year, and it's also an album that I keep seeing all over my like Twitter timeline and whatnot, it's a bit intimidating to approach. Long story short, we're talking about 3 albums this week, combined with our main episode here and our record club. And while it's not here yet, I own all 3 of these albums on vinyl now. This is the first album I've listened to this year that I have fully and completely fallen in love with. Which is funny. Which is funny because like it's the fucking end of February and we have had like 10 solidly great albums released this year, which just doesn't happen. It's wild to me that like we've had releases from people like Earl Sweatshirt and Cult of Luna and FK Twigs and like it's insane to me that this year has started off this way. So naturally I've liked a lot of albums that have been released so far, but there have been very few this year that I have been like, I've loved a lot of them, but I haven't fallen in love with them. I'd say maybe the Cloakroom's Dissolution Wave is maybe another one, but nobody gives a fuck about that album, so I can't really talk about it. But getting to like understand this and see what the hype is all about has been utterly joyous. This album, I've like needed this shit this week, is because this album is so warm and expansive, and it's just so wonderful to find yourself lost in. It reminds me a lot of my favorite double albums, which is sort of a like, even though I'm hesitant to approach longer albums like that, when I find a good double album or just a good long album to really sink my teeth into, it's always going to be something that I'm going to cherish because I love being lost within it the way that you can't be with musical experiences like that. It's fun to get lost inside bigger albums like this is the point that I'm making. I talked about this with an album like Autechre's Xi a couple of weeks ago, is that I find it a real treat. And I mean, we're probably going to talk about Beach House in that respect too. But this album reminds me a lot of my other favorite records like this. Notably, I think this has the most in common with my favorite album from any of the Beatles, which is George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. Which is an album that is similarly sprawling, long, has influence from multiple genres, multiple different experiments, and is still somehow very sonically cohesive, very warm. It's rock driven. It's got a lot of I almost feel like the albums are similarly structured in many ways. But the cool thing about this album is honestly how it manages to be so multifaceted without feeling jarring, and I think that's just down to the flow of the sequencing and the tracks here. You have something like Change with the opener, which I love this song, which is really like plain and plaintive. And in that first verse, you even get a little taste of like, there's a moment where she lyrically mentions space, and you just hear this like little ambient, ethereal kind of like wash in the background of the mix there. And that's sort of leaning on to the fact that this album has a lot of neo-psychedelia in it. Sonically, there's a lot of moments on here that actually remind me of another one of my favorite Americana artists and records, that being Sturgill Simpson's A Sailor's Guide to Earth, which is a very unique combination of psychedelia and outlaw country, which I think is found all over here, actually. And Change is a really good opener because it's very easy to swallow. I think Adrian's vocals on here are like, she's really, really channeling Stevie Nicks on this album, which is not at all a bad thing. Like, she's really leaning into the pronunciation of her consonants too on here. So it makes her sound like a little bit like she's almost kind of got a little bit of an accent, which is really nice to hear just because she's got an outstanding voice. But then you immediately go from Change, which is a really easy to grasp song, into Time Escaping, which is like the percussion on this song. What the fuck is happening on this song? It's like a fucking waterfall of drums, and you're just like, whoa. And then you go into Spud Infinity, which is this just absolutely rollicking Americana song which is so lyrically catchy and so fun. And within this 3-song span, you get a really good idea of the macro and micro of this album, is that it alternates between Adrian focusing on themes of really, really close interpersonal human intimacy and the vast expanse that humanity exists within the cosmos. Like literally, it's that big. She literally talks about, when I say extraterrestrial, like on the Spud Infinity, talking about, just how small humanity can be. But there's never like a hopelessness or a despair to that. It's like finding the magic in the simplicity of life, despite the vast expanse, is a really overwhelming and overriding theme here.
It's that line in Spud Infinity of what's it going to take to free the celestial body, the idea of like unleashing, yes, I think what she calls the alien in your own heart, and like that idea of like freedom of expression and freedom of being able to be the whatever kind of ugly wild creature is within you. And she's like that aspect of the inner person, the true understanding and knowing someone on a true level, and understanding and knowing yourself on a true level, is something that she's written about a lot and in lots of different forms. And she leans into sort of spiritual imagery, and she does evoke space and the cosmos a lot as well. And I'm sure, Mica, that you have thoughts on Adrian's sort of lyrical motifs and where she comes from as a lyricist as well.
Time Escaping is one of those tracks that what I kind of referenced earlier about Velvet Ring, where with Time Escaping, with it's called Little Things, which is my personal favorite on the album, and Dragon Newer Mountain, the title track. Like it's hard for me to describe, maybe because I just don't know how to talk like technically about music well enough, but it's just they have, like, these songs are about time. They're about sort of at times getting lost in memories. And they have a way of, through percussion and through like making their guitars and other instruments sound like they're taking up more space than they possibly could, that it becomes like very evocative of time, of like the way time moves and how time can be lost, how you can get lost within it. I find it very unique. Like I don't know anybody else who can move me to that level while also like making me feel like I'm transcending. It's awesome. And the way she talks about nature as well, that's something that I connected with Phil Elverum over the years, with him, with yes, Fleet Foxes and other bands like that. And like you were saying about the cosmos, taking these huge concepts, these huge parts of our reality, and instead of making them seem like we live in a cold and vast universe, a cold, vast and caring universe, that her love for like her partner who she left, who relationship I think dissolved in like 2019, to make her love for this person feel as infinite as the cosmos, gives it a warmth to this vastness that we live within, and a feeling of like belonging that I get from their music that is just just incredible, just heartwarming.
You note Phil Elverum, and there's a lot of influences on this album, but like the moment I heard Promise is a Pendulum, I was like, this is the most Phil Elverum shit I have ever heard in my life. And hell, the Radiohead influence on stuff like one of my favorite tracks on here, which is Blurred View, that sounds like it's right off of a moon-shaped pool. Like the way that this album just manages to hop around sonically without making me feel like it's inducing whiplash, like I physically like and mentally cannot comprehend why this is not a complete mess. And maybe it's just my love for all of the individual songs here, but like I even find joy in the like shorter, less substantive stuff like Heavy Bend, which has this beautiful fucking harp that plays in the background of it, which kind of transitions the first third of the album into the second third of it, which again, you go into like the 3-track run of Heavy Bend, Flower of Blood, which is another song that just sounds fucking incredible, and then right into Blurred View, you get like a little bit darker of a moment, but it kind of brings you back with the celebratory, like overwhelming joy of something like Red Moon, which again, super Neil Young, like just like so raucous and fun, and like the album takes you on so many different places. I think the album cover honestly is super evocative of the experience, is that this feels like some kind of like astral campfire that Adrian is like the storyteller of, and you're like listening to all these narrative digressions and stories. So once you get to the end of the album, you really do feel like you've been on this insanely long interpersonal journey. And god, like
Astral Campfire should be the name of the next Big Thief album.
Please.
That's an awesome way to describe it.
It sounds like an Animal Collective song. Like
yeah, there's like moments on this record, and I like to try and not use this word too much because it's so loaded with pretense and it's so overused. But so when I use it, I genuinely mean it. There are moments on this record that I find transcendental to listen to, and I don't just mean that as like as a term to try and like be hyperbolic about how awesome it is. I mean like moments on this record where I feel like I can sink into them and like it leave my body to a certain extent. Like the title
Adrian
track,
is channeling another world that you are finally getting to see.
the title track, I think, is like the most incredible example of this. A song which it's worth noting that when they play it live, it's this kind of raucous, incredibly sort of like intense song with a lot of sort of resonant guitar parts.
Really?
But on the record, it is stripped into something that's much sort of calmer overall. And the way I described it on Twitter today while I was listening to it was it sounds like it was beamed in from a distant planet where the mountains are made of clouds. I was getting on my poetic shit, reading along to Adrian's lyrics.
Right though.
But the way that she says, it's a little bit magic. Just the way that she says that, like she just kind of like, she feels like her voice is just this kind of disembodied presence that's kind of hanging over the soundscape like a kind of god. And in the way that she kind of like brings in a little bit more of that kind of timbre when she says, I believe in you. And she, again, this is what I was saying earlier about how she has this voice that's very distinct that might seem like it's quite limited in range, but she's able to kind of eke out these nuances and subtleties and variations in the way that she performs that just means you are fixated on her whenever she's performing. She's just incredible at doing that kind of thing. And I mean, the moments on this record that really transport me, that really kind of take me away to a different place are, I mean, there's so many of them that it's difficult to like even isolate particular choices. But one song I want to shout out is, and it's a bit weird because it's kind of like, it's a song that's so different from everything else on the record. And on any other record, it kind of wouldn't really work at all. But the point of the record where it happens, and also I think what it tells you in a really kind of elemental and simple way about Adrian's personality and songwriting, is Wake Me Up to Drive, which is what hands down one of my favorite songs on this record, which is interesting because it's like, the first time I listened to it, it was kind of like, well, okay, that's a bit strange. I'll come back to that. And gradually it's wormed its way up for me. What's notable about this is that it is probably, I don't know if it's fair to say it's the most stripped down thing here. It's probably not. That's probably changed, but it has the most lo-fi quality to it. It has what sounds like a kind of Casio keyboard preset beat. And it's very like, it feels like it was recorded very intimately into like a tape recorder or something like that. And the lyrical sentiment is very straightforward, and it lacks a lot of the intensely literary poetry that Adrian deploys on other parts of the record. But the way that the line, I think, Wake Me Up to Drive, even if I'm tired, I don't want to miss the ride. Like right there within that line, I think is a gorgeous encapsulation of Adrian's entire philosophical worldview of living, of being, not just living as well, but kind of being present in the world that you're in and being attuned to the nuances and beauty and details of the world that you're living in. Adrian has, I can't speculate on Adrian's like personal history and upbringing or anything like that, although there's certain aspects of her life that she has referred to in her songwriting. But Adrian has written songs that feel like they whatever that experience is, I can't say, but that feel like they channel like a reckoning with some kind of traumatic upbringing. I know that she was raised in what she described as a religious cult, so I don't want to speculate any further on that. There are songs that Adrienne has written in the past where you get a sense of her having, like, trying to make peace with some difficult part of her past related to people that she loves. And what's so beautiful about this record in particular, and songs like Wake Me Up to Drive, but I think it's scattered all over this record, maybe more so than any other previous Big Thief record, is a feeling of being grateful to be alive, a feeling of being like exhilarated by life, a feeling of not feeling weighed down by the kind of shadows of the past or even the shadows of the future, but like a kind of cosmic gratefulness for the present moment. And maybe I'm starting to sound a bit, airy fairy or whatever, but like that's the kind of mindset this record puts you in. So I think it's kind of the mindset you have to take to pick it apart. And that general feeling of like joyfulness and just general bliss is something that makes the album so attractive and beautiful and kind of carries across it, even in its darker moments, right? They're just a part of the natural ebb and flow of the dark and the light. Like, it doesn't mean that the world is all darkness. And of course, there's the lyric that recurs at the beginning and the end of this album, I want to live forever till I die. That is like the Wake Me Up to Drive song. That's also like this beautiful, simple little encapsulation of where Adrienne is at in her life. And another thing that makes this album so captivating is that she's communicating this feeling of like gratefulness to be alive, of like attuneness with the world around her. And as I said earlier, all of these other musicians who are with her are equally in tune with each other and in tune with her. So you have these songs about being in tune with the world that are made through this process that just exudes this synergy between these people in this room making it. And you feel it so deeply. I think it's part of the reason why the last two albums are just like, the album covers are just photos of the band, and you kind of get that sense of the real camaraderie that they have. But and I love Adrienne's solo work as well. It's beautiful, it's exclusively brilliant. But when the band are together and you get that feeling of synergy and communication that's happening even on an implicit level, I think it adds and fleshes out so much of that general feeling of joy, and maybe joy isn't even the right word, but kind of just like exhilaration at being alive and being in tune with the world and the people around you. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but I feel
it absolutely did
every time I listen to this record.
I completely agree with all of that. There's a moment in Time Escaping where she just suddenly goes, it's music. And it's just like, that moment always, it brings up as big a smile to my face as in Red Moon with the That's My Grandma shout out. Because it's like, the love and like the whole album, I feel like albums like this, and I would include like something like the White Album as well. Like they feel like celebrations of music and celebrations of the ability to create art and to express yourself and just being boundlessly creative with it. I also love the way the album ends where someone says, okay, what should we do next? Right at the very end of Blue Lightning. And then the album, and then this 80-minute album is over and you're like, oh, so you just feel like even this album, obviously, like, this isn't the end of the band, of course, but it's just like you're already looking forward to what's going to be coming next. And that applies to creation of music and to just life in general. I have also gotten the sense that there is a dealing with childhood trauma in their music and in Adrienne's solo stuff on an album like Ours Were the Birds, which I don't think is actually her debut album, but is sort of like, to me, where the start of the story really begins with her and the entire band. There's tracks like Gone that are just, that have a very youthful feeling to them, while also feeling like desperately lonely, desperately longing, wanting to find some kind of peace after having gone through something. And so, yeah, that I hadn't entirely thought about that before, like that this album is like feeling grateful to be alive after all of that. But yeah, that's beautiful. There's so many ways to think about this album to break it apart, because there's like There's something that Matt Berninger of The National said before, where like when he's asked if a song is like about romance or about politics or about death or whatever, he's like, it's about all of that. He can't separate any one of these things from any moment, from any lyric in any song that he's written. And that's a quality that is like present in a lot of songwriting that I really dig. And that's in spades in this album. The first time I listened to the album, and we went from Little Things to Heavy Bend and then Flower of Blood and Blurred View, and I was just like I feel like I had gone through, like I had gotten on a roller coaster ride, so I knew it was going to be crazy, but suddenly like I ended up on 3 different ones during this one ride, and I didn't know my whereabouts. But like I think like Jake said, when you get to Red Moon, we're sort of back from this slight direction into darkness, into something warm and raucous and fun again. And on Red Moon, there's some like the second to last verse where she's like, radio singing from the corner of the kitchen, I've got the oven on, I've got the onions wishing they hadn't made me cry. Like, I don't 100% have a full idea of how that ties into exactly what the song is about, but just an individual line like that, the amount of like the kind of energy there, like to use something like onions, to be so creative, to take the way that onions can draw tears out and to like say like, yeah, I'm getting back at them by cooking them. There's just something very just about the energy that I really dig. And I also love the idea of like turning off the TV, turning off movies, turning off television, and going outside and just being amazed by the wonders of nature, like seeing a glisten in the owl's eye, watching the red moon, looking at the violet sky. I really connect with stuff like that. So one day I actually took this album, not took the album, I played the album while I was out. I went hiking for a few hours, and listening to this album out in a natural setting just gave it a whole new life. I'm walking around little like random streams of kind of foresty area, just like, like kicking twigs and stuff, listening to Red Moon, or No Reason comes on, and I'm just like in a state of pure bliss, standing in a field of tall grass and stuff. Their music just like makes me feel connected to everything, to nature, to humanity, to everything. I just love that about them.
It's again one of those qualities that makes the album so attractive to listen to. And again, those little moments where you feel like you could be in the room with them, like the moments where the recordings just feel so intimate and closely mic'd and beautiful. Another one of my favorite songs on the album is Dried Roses, which comes kind of right after Red Moon at that point. And this to me is like, there's shades of Joni Mitchell in this, there's shades of a lot of kind of classical sort of 70s female singer-songwriters, but there's a particularly unique sort of, I don't even want to call it melancholic, because it's not melancholic, it's kind of peaceful, but also there's a sense of sadness to it in parts of it. And there's a sense of the weight of living to a certain extent as well. But then all of that is simplified and cancelled out and just pulled into this sort of 2-word phrase of dried roses. Like that is those words are used to kind of channel the loneliness and the excitement and the overwhelming feeling that Adrian experiences in a kind of mundane domestic situation, and just taking all of that feeling, that boundless feeling, and just kind of condensing it into dried roses and coming back to that as a lyrical motif is, I find it really moving. And again, like it's the intimacy of the way it's recorded as well. Like those little quieter moments on this album have so much impact because they're treated in their own way. Like they're treated intimately, and the louder moments are treated like hugely. And it's not like this album, which has all these different sounds, is produced in this really monochromatic way. It's not like that at all. It is the production and the general sound and the intensity of the mix and whatever is adjusted to suit the needs of every individual song, which makes it even more miraculous that the whole thing hangs together the way it does. I think, yeah, as a point of contrast with a song like Dried Roses, which is one of the most spare things here, you have a song like Little Things, which is, again, one of many tracks that like Big Thief have like at least one, often more than one song on every album where you just kind of, they take the opportunity to kind of just bowl you away with the sound design they can wring out of their instrumentations. And the intensity of this song, Like it's like an REM song, like 5 REM songs put in a blender and then like turned up. So you have this kind of like jangling quality, but it's like super loud and kind of almost compressed to a certain extent. And it's just kind of invading your brain while you're listening to it. And it's so beautiful. There's like elements, like another band that I was reminded of at certain points during this record, production wise and in just in terms of the approach to instrumentation, is Wilco. I think I already know a few people who love Wilco who are really, really into Big Thief. There's a big sense of overlap there, I think. And like in the sound design of a song like Little Things, where you have this kind of like intense, persistent guitar and these kind of like atmospheric washes of sound, you very much evoke a record like Yankee Hotel Foxtrot or A Ghost Is Born. Whereas then you have other songs like Spud Infinity and No Reason and The Only Place, maybe, that kind of evoke a little bit more of that later 2000s Wilco. But yeah, and of course, while we're making record comparisons, a pretty obvious one as well on the note of this kind of big, ambitious indie rock double album is Being There. Wilco's second record, I think, from 1999, is very much kind of like feels like a blueprint for this, as does Fleetwood Mac's Tusk, which is a comparison I keep coming back to, because that, while that record is much more dour and somber and sad in tone overall, it has the same sense of like eclecticism in terms of you will be thrown from one song to something that's completely different, and you're experiencing kind of the creative whims of artists who are totally unrestrained in any way, which is again another part of the lively, exciting nature of this album, I think.
If I didn't make it clear earlier, I'm pretty sure the title track on this record is probably the biggest frontrunner for my favorite song of the year. And the best part is, and to put why I think this album is so great and why I love it so much, is that I don't really know why. Like, I'm not even entirely certain I know what Adrian is even talking about on this song. Same goes for Simulation Swarm, which is another song I find similarly compelling. You get a better idea of what that song is about, I think. But both of these songs captivate me for very ephemeral reasons. And overall, it kind of feels like the album itself is sort of channeling that ephemeral quality that you have to properly live with for you to discover the song's meaning to you, which I think this record is sort of designed to have its own personal experience with everyone who engages with and listens to it. And that's just, it's perfectly designed for somebody like me, and I feel like somebody like Riley, just to engage with it in that very particular way. And I'm infinitely grateful for it, because it's been an amazing source of comfort for the last week. And I really just look forward to letting myself live with it even longer.
I'm gonna be real with y'all. Simulation Swarm is my favorite song on this album, and
Great song.
I mean I listened to this album like a dozen times now, I think, in full, and then individual songs maybe probably more than that. I cannot listen to this song without crying. I just can't do it.
Really emotional, and I don't even really understand all of it.
It has I think my favorite chorus of this whole album in terms of both melody and lyricism. The way that she sings, "I'd fly to you tomorrow. I'm not fighting in this war. I want to drop my arms and take your arms and walk you to the shore." Like that, to me, I mean, that's one of the most comforting and loving lyrics that I think I've ever heard in my life. And it's not even just the word, it's the way it's delivered as well. She has this, what I would term, quiet urgency in this song, in the way that she sings, in that she doesn't really raise her voice very much. She's kind of a few notches above a whisper for most of it, but she's singing so fast and she's getting through words so quickly, it's like they're tumbling out of her mouth, but she has to keep herself quiet in order, because if she lets herself go up, get too like intense in her voice, then she'll fall apart. And there is a sense of urgency the song has because of that. It's relatively pared back, but there are moments where the instrumentation swells, like on the chorus. There's this sort of really lovely, beautiful finger-picked melody that is classic Big Thief to me. A lot of their best songs kind of have that sense of a lilting sort of finger-picked acoustic melody, but there's so much atmosphere and space in the song. And it's also a song that I've grown to appreciate more and more and more the more I've fallen in love with Big Thief as well, because I mean, like a lot of Adrian's songs, it's very personal, and you can read into it and understand and appreciate more of that the more you know about Adrian. What I think is my favorite Big Thief song overall, which is Mythological Beauty off of Capacity. That's a song that where she talks about her feelings about her long lost brother, essentially, who she's never met, who her mother gave up at birth, Andy. And that song, she refers to him quite extensively, and she refers to him again on Simulation Swarm. And the way that she sings about him, I believe we can renew, and you could be my brother once again, fall asleep with our backs against each other. You believe, I believe too, that you are the river of light who I love, that I sing to in the belly of the empty night. Those lyrics, the way she delivers them, again, that quiet intensity, but the beauty of it is so impactful, and communicates that connection that she has to someone she's never met, as far as we know, so strongly that it really it becomes emblematic of this whole vibe of the record, where it's like there is a connection between you and every other living thing in the world, like an inherent connection, that Adrienne has reached a place in her life where she is able to tap into that connection. And even though she's never met her brother, because she's so connected with the world around her now, she can feel that she knows him. She can feel that she can fly to him tomorrow, that she can walk him to the shore, that she can have this, deep connection to, regardless of whether they are together or whether she actually knows him, in the sense that we all know each other. The way this song kind of feeds into that connection to the world thing, but brings in this personal aspect of Adrian's life, like it really, it really gets to me, man. Oh.
I was going to say, Mythological Beauty, Simulation Swarm, another song on Capacity called Haley, and on Masterpiece. What is the one on Masterpiece? There's another track on that album where she talks of, Animals, which is like one of the more math rocky songs on there. In all of those songs, she talks about either reconnecting with someone lost, usually her brother, or having to leave someone, but still trying to express love for them. And I think those are some of her most powerful songs. Mythological Beauty, like Simulation Swarm, incredibly cathartic while also being comforting at the same time. The story she's ultimately telling in the song is, in the end, it essentially works out in that one, where she, I think what happens is like she falls and hits her head when she was really young, and her mother rushes her to the hospital. But in the moment where the band is trying to express that you don't know what's going to happen, that they didn't know at the time whether she was going to survive, whether she was going to be okay. The intensity that the song brings is just, it's insane. It's moved me to tears multiple times. And you feel like like I scream along to the song when I listen to it. And then a song like Haley, they have a way of being so punchy with like James's drumming can be so punchy during these songs that are also incredibly moving. Simulation Swarm, I've actually compared it to like Pink Pantheress, oddly enough. It's just the drumming that James is doing in that song is so catchy. I get caught up in it every time. But at the same time, I'm also super, super moved.
One song I want to shout out that we haven't gotten to yet, that's really kind of started to hit me more and more, is the second to last song on this album, The Only Place, which again, I feel like emblematic of all of the things that we've talked about right from the go. What if all the worlds and space would melt into one single place and intertwine the human race with other kinds? The atom is an empty vase, a vehicle to no embrace. The way you feel, the way you taste, it multiplies. When all material scatters and ashes amplify, the only place that matters is by your side. What if all the time between the words we say and what we mean would roll as softly as a stream that we could ride? We'd ride the bend from source to mouth. I want a friend from north to south to build that question as a house where we'd reside. I just had to read the lyrics because I feel like trying to break them down or like trying to describe them without reading them would be doing them a disservice. Everything you need to know about this record and about what's beautiful about it and about what can, I think, be so life affirming in it is in this song, is in those lyrics. That sense of eternal comfort and eternal company. And that's the fact that Big Thief, to me, this album is one big testament to not being alone in the universe. And in whatever way you want to interpret that. And I think it comes to a head where it's maybe distilled or refined down to its most powerful expression on The Only Place, which, yeah. Incredible. All right, well, let's wrap this up then and talk about it and move into our favorite tracks and ratings for the Big Thief album. Jake, why don't you lead us off with your 3 favorite tracks and your rating?
My 3 favorite tracks are going to be the title track, Dragon New War Mountain, I Believe in You, Blurred View, and fuck it, Simulation Swarm. I know least favorite tracks. I'm going to hedge here. 9.5 out of 10. I've not lived with this enough, but I have a feeling that score is not going to stay the same. Just saying.
All right. My 3 favorite tracks are Simulation Swarm, Little Things, and I'm going to say Dried Roses. Fuck it. Least favorite, no. I mean, there are songs here that I think I would rank lower if I were to rank the album, but I don't even want to. It's all amazing. And this is, and I've toiled over this for 2 weeks now. Like, what rating am I going to give it? It was at a 9 for the longest time, but just this morning, I finally brought myself to the decision where I'm like, yeah, no, this is a 10 out of 10. And so there we have it. That's my rating. Like it.
So my 3 favorite tracks, Little Things, Red Moon, and The Only Place. And speaking of The Only Place, I had heard this track. It was one of the few that wasn't a single that I'd heard prior to the album coming out, because Adrian had performed it solo on Instagram. And if you can find the video for that on YouTube, anyone who really digs this band and wants to find it, it's a beautiful performance. It's even more intimate than this one here, even more hushed and I think moving in a way. But I'm so glad that they kept some tracks that feel like they could have been on Adrian's solo work here. So you have The Only Place, and you have Promises of Pendulum, and I'd say Dried Roses too. They all feel like they could have been, I saw someone describe them as like outtakes from songs that are just as good as the songs on songs. And that's how I would describe it. But I would say those 3 tracks, yeah. And then, yeah, I'm not gonna even pick a least favorite here. There were tracks that took a while to grow on me, but like I can't even if I did pick one, it would probably be Blurred View, just because when it kind of stays kind of the same up until you get to that rush of synths near the end. I mean, that's just such a nitpick because it fits beautifully into the album. It's such an awesome moment. It's you can't really quite put your finger on exactly what she's saying, but you get some ideas, and they're both, again, haunting and comforting at the same time. And all in all, yeah, I have to give this album a 10. A few days after it came out, I'm like, let me actually just calm down a little bit. I'm too big of a stand for this band to just be jumping in and giving it a 10. But no, it's a goddamn 10.
That was exactly my process as well. I need to make sure I'm not just jumping the gun, but no. So that is an average rating of 9.8 from the 3 of us for Big Thief's Dragon New War Mountain, I Believe in You. Now let's move into the second album that we're going to review today, which is just with me and Mica, and that is Beach House's Once Twice Melody. Now, Beach House are a legacy dream pop act, probably the biggest act in that genre working today. I mean, almost to the point of having a monopoly over modern dream pop discourse and discussion. Like, they're so dominant. They rose to prominence in the late 2000s, and then I think with 2010's Teen Dream embarked upon a string of incredibly critically beloved, and I mean, personally, I am a huge fan of all of their records. They brought a real sense of pop immediacy and dense sort of orchestration and beauty to dream pop that elevated it above, I guess, some of the more sedentary dream pop bands of the time, like Real Estate, for instance. Beach House always kind of stood well above the pile in terms of how good they were at creating these dense and intimate and beautiful atmospheres of sound that pull you in so much. And Victoria Legrand, singer, frontwoman of this band, always really good at crafting melodic hooks and sort of bringing you along in a way that makes the songs feel sort of accessible, despite how sometimes more formless they may be. Reached a kind of pop peak with 2012's Bloom, which is still probably to date their most kind of accessible and generally beloved record. Then sort of went into the weeds a bit with the two albums they put out in 2015, Depression Cherry and Thank Your Lucky Stars. I'm personally really, really fond of both of those records, particularly Depression Cherry, but they kind of do go in a sort of moodier and more sort of like, I think, thick atmospheric direction that kind of pulls back from some of the poppier, brighter instincts of Teen Dream and Bloom. And then you had 2018's Seven, which was almost kind of like a rejuvenation of the band to a certain extent. Like, they're some of their punchiest production yet, some of their most immediate songs. It wasn't Bloom, but it felt like it was a really sharp refinement of how catchy and accessible Beach House could be, while also sort of giving you soundscapes and instrumentation that was as interesting as it had ever been. But I think with Beach House, for a lot of people that I've spoken to, it's kind of a band where you're into them or you're not into them. And it's like no one album is going to change that. It's not going to be like you listen to Bloom and you disliked it, but you'll like, I don't know, Thank Your Lucky Stars or whatever. I think you either dig this band or you don't. And so with any Beach House record, I think no matter what, like they're such a consistent band in quality and in terms of like how being recognizable in what they do, that if you're not a Beach House fan, whatever record they're working on now is probably not going to convert you. But it has to be said that they're certainly kind of upping the ante with this new record, Once Twice Melody. It is a double album, 80 minutes, as we mentioned earlier. It is obviously their longest album to date. The release pattern for this record was unusual as well. It was kind of split into 4 quarters that were released individually a month apart. So I think in November we got Chapter 1, December we got Chapter 2, January we got Chapter 3, and then along with the full release of the album, Chapter 4, just a week ago. And so it was an interesting release strategy because it allowed you to consume the album in these kind of bite-sized chunks, such that by the time it was out in full, most Beach House fans, unless you were saving yourself, had already kind of experienced a good chunk of the record. And so as a result of that, I have like more familiarity with the earlier parts of the records and the later parts of the records just because they've been in my life for so long. But yeah, okay, I'm curious about, so your relationship with Beach House, your kind of how long you've been into their music, how you feel about it, what your thoughts and opinions are on that release strategy, what extent you kind of listened during the rollout, and yeah, sort of where you're at overall at this point.
So I first got into Beach House, if I remember correctly, when Seven was coming out. I think there were a couple singles for that, and those were kind of intriguing, but it was listening to the album a couple times over that really got to me. There's something about like music that feels kind of simple to me, and like where like what's awesome about is kind of on the surface, where like I'll need to return to it to like be fully convinced that I really dig this, that there's like really something magical here. So like I think when I first was trying to get into them, it took a little while, but yeah, Seven was really the one. It just had some tracks like Drunken LA that I found really devastating, and that like where my initial impression was that Victoria was kind of like a kind of vibey lyricist, if that makes sense. that she actually has some really interesting imagery that she brings up in her music. Like in that one, she has this girl who's thinking about, if I remember correctly, like the shortness of life, or a lack, or like how, like her privilege in life. And she mentions a strawberry, and how it's like this really like unique thing, this sweet thing that just comes about naturally, that just happens to exist. And that kind of makes me think of like I guess the main character of that song's sort of feeling about their just happening to exist in that one. So anyway, so it was 7, and then I just slowly just went through their entire discography. I came across Devotion at one point, and that one took a little bit of time to fully grow on me, but now, and it's been this way for a while, Devotion is my favorite Beach House album. And I have, like, I guess, a kind of weird ranking of their records, but it's like, to me, Devotion and Teen Dream, the one right after it, that was where they hit their peak. That was where they made just incredibly consistent, beautiful, warm, just like the warmest toned albums in the world. And I have a love for all of their records, although their debut, I think, is a little, I think the glow up from their debut to Devotion is pretty wild to me. But yeah, that was basically my journey with Beach House. With this new album, with the way that they released it, I was hesitant about it. I wasn't entirely sure if I liked splitting the album like that, because Moses Sumney had did a similar thing in like, I think it was 2020 when he split Gray in two, and it felt like there was just such a long time between those two parts that just didn't need to be there. But with this one, I actually really liked the way it was released, especially as I realized like each chapter has a slightly different vibe and sort of kind of builds to its finale. I love that, like, when I listen to the album all together now, I can feel like the third one is like the most moving to me, with a track like Sunset and tracks like Illusion of Forever. Oh my God, those are such beautiful and moving tracks. And then the last chapter, actually, it's moving in a different way. A track like Hurts to Love is very fun and incredibly vibrant, but it's also there is something like that feels like a finale about it. And same with the final track. It's so grand and like gargantuan sized. And I wouldn't say it's moving in quite the same way the third one is, but it builds to a climax that I can't help but get just totally caught up in emotionally. So I mess with the way it was released. I am slightly more familiar with the previous 3 chapters as well, and with each one, you know, slightly less than, but I think they all come together beautifully.
Yeah, I think so. Like around the time of Depression Cherry and Thank Your Lucky Stars, it felt like Beach House was sort of retreating inward into this kind of like really sort of, and I say this in a positive way because I love those records, but kind of a monotonous sort of really sort of gauzy, hazy, sort of vibey landscape. And then they kind of came out of that with 7, and that's kind of the inverse of those 2 albums in a lot of ways. And with Once Twice Melody, it feels like they've kind of reconciled the different sort of directions production wise and sonics wise that they've explored with, you know, the limited palette of their sound. And you have a kind of tapestry of songs that do kind of have their own uniform identity as an album. And a big part of that is the increased presence of strings on this record, which are super, super like great sounding and give these songs a part of that sort of feeling of like scale that these songs have is really present and is done by those strings. But it's kind of like these are widescreen, big scale songs, but they're produced in this really kind of like murky and sort of hazy way. So it's not like an album like Bloom where it's kind of all very sort of clean and just sparkly and exuberant. It's like you have that sense of hugeness within the music, but it feels more intimate at the same time, which is kind of a paradox. And yeah, so the release pattern, I think I agree, is what ended up, I was hesitant about it, but I ended up thinking that it was a really great way to release this record because each of those chapters kind of functions like its own little EP, I think, and can be consumed sort of individually and sort of regarded in its own right, I think. Like if you're not in the mood to listen to 80 minutes of Beach House, which I can understand, you can decide, you can pick a chapter essentially and based on how you're feeling and just kind of vibe out to that, and then kind of not feel the need to consume the whole thing at once. I think that kind of ties into my one sort of major reservation about this record, which is that it is a lot to consume. It is a lot of beach house in one record, and it's definitely not a monotonous record. There's a lot of variation here, but when you're listening to it as a single 80-minute experience, there are points where it feels like it starts to become sort of difficult to disentangle certain moments from other moments, which is more of a nitpick than a strong, decisive criticism, because the quality of the songwriting in general is so strong. But I think that I've enjoyed this record more when I've consumed these individual parts as their own sort of holistic thing than when I listen to the entire thing front to back. Like in the last week or so, there's been a lot of times where I've just put on chapter 4, since it's the newest one, and I've just listened to that and sort of taken it in. But it's to the record's credit that I have a really difficult time like picking a favorite chapter, and that my feelings on that almost change depending on my mood or depending on the day. Like there's so like each chapter is like so equally well-rounded, and maybe has like one or two songs I'm not as huge on maybe as much, but always has at least one or two real like, damn, this is a great beach house song standouts. I think at the moment my current favorite chapter is probably chapter 2, which I've been listening to a lot recently. I especially think that the 1-2 of New Romance and Over are just two of my favorite songs this band have ever recorded. Over and Over, I think there was a period earlier this week where I was like, is this my favorite beach house song? Like it's one of their longest songs, and it just has this like super hypnotic, sort of repetitive, gorgeous, sort of picked but heavily reverbed guitar passage that it kind of seeps into in the second half. That's so like hypnotic and pretty and gorgeous. And I like that the song is allowed to kind of expand outward for that amount of time too. I think it really accentuates that. It's currently my favorite on the record for sure. But you equally have like moments like that and moments like Superstar as well, which is another big standout, which stretches on for 6 minutes and has this gorgeous sort of guitar motif that it kind of eases into at the end in the second half of the song. That's so beautiful. You have songs like that, and you have songs that really see beach house reminding you how hard they can really punch you in the throat as well. Like one of my favorite beach house songs is Sparks off of Depression Cherry, and a big part of that is because it's such a ripping song that's so unlike anything else they've ever done. And they have plenty of those moments on this album. I think the first one is Pink Funeral, which just has this real sense of grandiosity, but it becomes more pronounced, I think, in certain songs in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Well, New Romance is one, but chapter 3 I think is the part of the album that has the most kind of left turns, with songs like Only You Know, which I mean I remember so distinctly the first time I heard that, and I was like, whoa, when that song like kind of just explodes at its chorus and becomes this huge thing. And then Masquerade as well is like such a left turn too. It's like it's almost like moody and dark, but it's also like really hard hitting and intense. I'll echo the sentiment on Sunset as well. Like my previous favorite beach house song before this album came out was Levitation, the opening track on Depression Cherry, which is just so like, it's such it's gobsmacking how much that song just captures me. And Sunset gives me a really similar vibe, except it's more sort of like transitory. It's more just another part of the album that you're exploring, but it has that, it's so enrapturing, gorgeous and beautiful. And yeah, like the way you can go from songs like Sunset to songs like Only You Know and just feel the ebb and flow of the album, of the individual chapters. It's so well constructed, I think. Even if I'm not entirely like 100% that it should have been like an 18-track, 80-minute album, like for an 18-track, 80-minute album, sequencing and the structure is immaculate. This thing is the best version of itself that it could be, I think.
Pink Funeral, I think, is a really interesting track, because when I was listening to chapter 1 the night it dropped, and I'm just like totally lost in the hype, and having that hype met, which is one of the best feelings in the world, I was getting Broadcast vibes off of what they were doing. Broadcast is one of my favorite. I don't know if you could even call them a band. It was I think it was two people near the end, just Trish Keenan and James but yeah, I get that vibe off of their music, off of the new Beach House.
Yeah.
Pink Funeral is like a grand strings laced broadcast track to me. And then it leads beautifully into Through Me, which has that amazing chorus that I get totally into that. That is as hype to me as like the hypest I don't know, like a Migos song that just drives me wild.
Well, I mean, that song Through Me has like what sounds like a trap beat at the very end of it, like just these little like clicking hi-hats that come in, and it's like, and even Pink Funeral as well has this kind of like pulse to it that feels very like foreign for Beach House, just in the beat that it has. Like, I think I've seen Beach House get shtick thrown at them for like, you know, drum machine go burr sort of thing, and it's kind of just like, but I think that especially because they alternate between like drum machine sounds and like live drum sounds on a lot of their records. But I think what's underrated is the way that Alex Skelly uses drum machines on Beach House records. It's never just like, let's put a drum machine over it. Like, it always feels appropriate. It always, sometimes like on a record like Thank You Lucky Stars, it can give it a kind of like music box childhood feel as well. Whereas here it's used in a very different way. But yeah, the drum patterns and the programming and all this sort of that rhythmic aspect is always very well considered, I think, and maybe a little bit overlooked in discussions of Beach House. But yeah, it's always like there's a little flavor in that percussion that gives the songs an extra little bit of special sauce that I think always, you know, makes a Beach House song worth its time. And I think really comes to the fore on that first half of the record, actually, now that I think about it, and that first chapter in particular, which is, you know, maybe the first chapter actually might be from front to back, those 4 songs might be the most sort of consistently fantastic, even if it's maybe the least kind of surprising overall. But I don't know, it's so hard to kind of like disentangle them because they're so like, again, well put together, where you're getting so much variation on all of them. But maybe I'll feel that way about chapter 4. Maybe I just haven't heard chapter 4 enough, but God.
I think chapter 1, even though I would probably rank the chapters like 3, 4, 1, and 2, I think chapter 1 is the perfect way to start it. It does feel like the beginning of a new era. And I think those 4 songs, there is a consistency to them that really works. It was so exciting when they dropped chapter 1 and hearing those 4 tracks. That was such an amazing night. So yeah, that totally works. Yeah, chapter 2, it's interesting that that's your favorite, because that's been my least favorite, but it's continued to grow on me and grow on me and grow on me. New Romance, the way those choruses break through is so awesome. It just blows my mind every time. And just like, and I'm dancing. I'm dancing to all of these songs internally or externally.
Yeah, that's actually another cool aspect of it as well, is like there's the sense of like fun that Beach House are having on this album a lot of the time that you really connect to as well. It feels like, especially when they are reaching into more sort of newer sounds for them on songs like Masquerade and stuff, like you feel like there's it's just really exciting to listen to. And I will say the chapter 4 is like really, like initially when I heard it, I was a little bit like, I was, I think, so saturated by the rest of the album that I couldn't really fully appreciate it, but it has really grown on me throughout the week. I think Hurts to Love is like just a maybe not an S tier Beach House song, but definitely like an A tier Beach House song. It's like it feels so immediately classic. That guitar part is just so simple but so beautiful. I love the textures on Finale that open up chapter 4. That's just like, again, simple, maybe even too easy to take for granted. But when I think about songs on this record, like that'll just come back into my head, that little melody and the texture of it. And I'm really grateful for it. And then Modern Love Stories. I mean, what a fucking way to end this record, man. Like it feels like the most expansive Beach House song in a long time in so many ways. Like, again, I talk about those strings that they use on this album, and boy, oh boy, like man, it feels definitely like the culmination to a certain extent. I remember when chapter 2 came out and I got obsessed with Over and Over, and I'm like, how are they going to end this album with a song that's more like feels more of like a conclusion than this? And I mean, they fucking pulled it off.
Yeah, that reminds me of another incredible thing about this album. Every chapter, at least to me, ends in an incredibly satisfying way, and with just a fantastic song. Through Me and Over, Illusion of Forever, and Modern Love Stories. I mean, they all work as an excellent closer for any standard, really good album, but they are closers for individual parts of this massive, beautiful, sort of like Disney-sized album. To me, this album gives me like a big, grand sort of Disney feel in a way that an album like Illinois by Sufjan does, where there's like this, like I said, the grandness, but then there's also a kind of like, with the orchestration, kind of like ornateness to it, while also being incredibly fun, incredibly colorful, lots of personality. All those things coming together just makes for a really lovely time.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, let's move on to our favorite tracks and ratings then.
My overriding thoughts are that this is excellent. It's great. I love it. 3 favorite tracks probably going to be Superstar, Runaway, and Masquerade. Least favorite track is probably Many Nights, and I give the album an 8 out of 10.
Cool. My favorite tracks are Over and Over, Sunset, I want to say. And for my third pick, I will pick, Modern Love Stories. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with that. So those are my 3. Least favorite, if I had to pick one, it's still a really strong song, but it does feel a little bit, it kind of sits between 2 such massive tracks and it doesn't quite stick out in the same way. And that's Another Go Around. Although what I will say on that track, I guess the one thing that I really forgotten to comment on is like the relationship between Victoria and Alex, how kind of synergistic they are, and how like sort of one singular organism that they are, and how well they go together. And this is a beautiful song, I guess, about the continuance of that relationship and how perfect they are for each other. So even though it's my least favorite sonically, I really appreciate that aspect of it. I'm going to give the album a 7.5, I think. Really, it's very close to an 8. Very much enjoy it. I think that, again, as I said, those individual chapters, I think, work better as individual listening experiences than the whole thing for me. But it's still another great beach house record, man. Like, it's still like another fantastic set of songs from a band that, if you love this band, you'll like this album. If you don't like this band, you will not like this album, will not change your mind. It's basically all there is to it.
For my favorite tracks, I'm gonna have to also go with Modern Love Stories. That is just one of the best closers ever to me, in an album with 3 other excellent, technically, closers. So that one, I'm gonna say Only You Know. And man, I'd like to go with Pink Funeral to like have like each one from a different chapter, but I think I'm gonna have to go with Sunset. Sunset has moved me to tears multiple times. It's just so serene. It's just it's like just a wave of like heavenly light hitting you in the face. So I'm gonna go with those 3. A least favorite track, I'll say about like tracks like Another Go Around as well, and The Bells and Many Nights. I have love for these tracks, but every time I listen to the album, not every time I listen to the album, but when I'm like picking like maybe like 10 songs to listen, I often skip over them. But then when I do take the time to listen, I'm enchanted all over again. It's just because I think they're a little less urgent, a little less have that pop fun sense that they all have. But for an album that is 84 minutes long and just captivates me the whole time and is just like a beautiful ride to me, I will have to give it a 9 out of 10.
Fantastic. So that is an average of 8.2 for Beach House's Once Twice Melody. All right. that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you for watching. We want to hear from you at home. If you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening to the podcast on Spotify or Apple, hit up the YouTube page and let us know what you think of the albums that we've discussed today. Big Thief's Dragon, New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, and Beach House's Once Twice Melody. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you agree? Do you disagree? We've been pretty enthusiastic across the board about these two albums, but maybe you have a different take. Don't be scared to share it if you do. We want to hear from you, so hit us up and let us know. Make sure you stick around for our next record club, which should be, all things permitting, on the Mountain Goats All Hail West Texas on Tuesday. That's going to be really exciting to reflect on for me and Jake to reflect on the 20th anniversary of that fantastic record. And I want to take this final moment, though, to thank you, Mica, for joining us. It's been really great to have another new guest, especially one who's so passionate about the music that we're discussing this week. It's been awesome to have you. Honestly, we couldn't have done this without you this week. So thank you for showing up with reasonably short notice and being able to really kind of show off your love and extensive knowledge of these bands. It's been really awesome having you.
It's an absolute blast to do this. I haven't been on a podcast before, and I just love talking about stuff that I'm passionate about. So this was just a really awesome time.
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow Mica on Twitter. We'll put his handle in the description below, but I believe it's Spangled_Mica. To everyone listening at home, if you like the episode, it would mean a lot to us if you hit the like button on the YouTube page, or if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, to give us a 5-star rate and review. Those things really help us out if you enjoyed the podcast, of course. If you want to go the extra mile, you can hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel if you have not done that already. If you want to support us, there is also the option of hitting the join button on our YouTube page as well. For just $1 a month, you can support us and get your name featured in the title crawl of every video on the YouTube channel, as well as getting priority comment response. And if you want to give us a recommendation, it goes to the top of the pile. So those options are available as well if you want to support us. Other than that, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago. IMAX. Think big.